Okay, so today we're diving deep into all this stuff happening with the Ukraine war.
Yeah.
And specifically all this recent, like, super intense diplomatic activity,
Right.
particularly anything that has to do with Donald Trump's involvement.
Of course.
Yeah. And the very complicated picture of ceasefire negotiations.
Hmm.
Like, I feel like if you're listening to this, you're probably like me and trying to, like, stay in the loop without, getting completely lost in all the updates every day.
Yeah, it's impossible to keep up with.
So that's kind of our mission today to, go through all of this and pull out what seems most crucial and really try to get a good understanding of what is happening here.
Exactly. And we've got, I think, a pretty fascinating set of sources. We've got recent reports, analyses, detailing Trump's conversations with Putin and Zelensky, various different proposals for how a ceasefire might even work.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we have to look at reactions, especially across Europe. And I think our goal here is to understand what's driving these key players, Trump, Putin, Zelensky,
Right.
and get a clearer sense of whether there's any real path towards peace emerging from all of this.
Yeah. I mean, are these negotiations even real, or is this all just for show?
Right, exactly.
Let's unpack this. And I guess a good place to start would be Trump's recent diplomatic activity.
Sure.
These phone calls with Putin and Zelensky really seem to have shaken things up, haven't they?
Absolutely. They have, these calls represent a really significant level of direct engagement.
Mm-hmm.
We have to remember, we're talking about, two of the, major players in this whole conflict.
Right.
And what I think is especially noteworthy is Trump's, him putting forward this idea of a 30-day ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal. And I think Putin's initial refusal of that is very telling.
Yeah. I mean, he flat out said no.
Right. And it's like,
Which I guess you could expect.
yeah, I mean, you can, but, despite that rejection, Trump is already, trying to spin it. Like, the fact that these conversations are even happening, at this level, it's a diplomatic win.
Right.
And it's a bold move, I think, given the very apparent setback,
Mm-hmm.
And then if we look at, the bigger picture, the White House is emphasizing, significant progress.
Right.
And I think there could be a couple layers to this. For one, there might be a genuine desire to keep any possibility of de-escalation alive,
Right.
no matter how remote it seems right now. And secondly, it certainly aligns with Trump's image.
Yeah.
The whole, I'm a deal maker, I can make things happen.
Right, exactly. And this is a stark contrast to Putin's response, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, his new conditions for a ceasefire are insane.
Yeah.
Ukraine's demobilization, a complete, change in their government, and NATO essentially retreating in Eastern Europe.
Right.
Like, those aren't just like tough negotiating points.
Right.
It's like he's living in a different reality.
Well, that's the thing. It's not even really negotiating at that point, is it?
No, it's not.
And I think what's really going on is that Putin, he's insisting on this demobilization.
Right.
And it's not just about, reducing Ukraine's current military strength. It's about preventing them from ever posing a future threat.
Yeah, like they can never, ever be strong enough to challenge us again.
Exactly. So locking them into this position of permanent vulnerability.
Right.
And then, demanding a change in government. I mean, that's signaling that Russia wants to install a regime that's subservient to its interests.
Right.
So, negating Ukraine's right to self-determination.
It's crazy. I mean, it's just not going to happen.
Right. And these conditions basically, they strike at the heart of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
So making them, completely unacceptable.
Right.
But the thing is, I think the Kremlin is playing a longer game here.
Hmm.
They're offering Trump this potential for a really strong relationship, possibly to secure, future concessions. So,
Okay, so let's move on to Zelensky now.
sure.
He seems to be in a very delicate position, diplomatically speaking.
Right.
The sources mentioned this need for him to be agreeable with Trump,
Yeah.
especially after that disastrous Oval Office meeting. Do you know anything more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important to understand about Zelensky's current stance is that, Ukraine is in a very precarious situation, right? He can't risk alienating a potential future U.S. administration,
Right.
given how crucial U.S. support has been and will be.
Right.
So this reference to this disastrous Oval Office meeting
Yeah.
refers to a previously reported tense encounter where, there were some very clear disagreements over aid and strategy.
Yeah.
So now there's a clear incentive for Zelensky to be seen as cooperative with Trump,
Yeah.
almost regardless of the immediate outcome, to avoid being isolated internationally.
Right, so he has to play nice.
Yeah, yeah.
So is there like some irony here? Zelensky has consistently said that he doesn't trust Putin to commit to any kind of ceasefire.
Right.
And now Putin basically proves him right by rejecting this proposal.
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, Zelensky's earlier reservations now appear totally well-founded, right?
Totally, yeah.
And as a result, we've seen a very noticeable shift in his public statements. He's adopted this much more conciliatory tone
Towards Trump.
Towards Trump and the U.S., expressing gratitude, in a way that's very different from, his previous, more direct appeals for support.
Right. Well, he did say, we believe that together with America, with President Trump and under American leadership, lasting peace can be achieved this year. I mean,
right. That's a pretty big statement.
I mean, that's a huge change in rhetoric, wouldn't you say?
It is. It is.
Yeah.
It is. And, it clearly signals this strategic decision to align himself with Trump's efforts.
Yeah.
However uncertain the path forward may be. And, it's important to note that he's also been really consistent in emphasizing, that security guarantees have to be, a fundamental component of any eventual peace agreement.
Right.
Which I think really underscores Ukraine's deep-seated fears about future Russian aggression.
Right, of course. Well, then there's this other thing that Trump brought up, this idea that the U.S. could take ownership of Ukrainian power plants.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it seems a little crazy, but what do we know about this?
Well, what I found really fascinating was that Zelensky, he clarified that their discussion really focused on this Zaporizhia nuclear power plant,
Right.
which is currently under Russian occupation.
Right.
So he indicated an openness to this idea, but only within that specific context.
Right, so that's just one plant.
Right, exactly. And, the White House seems to be stepping back from the idea of, the U.S. actually owning Ukraine's energy resources more broadly.
Right.
Emphasizing instead these ongoing discussions about a longer-term peace settlement.
Right. So are they walking that back now?
Yeah, it feels like there are some mixed messages here.
Right.
If we try to connect this to the bigger picture, we see this joint statement from, figures like Michael Waltz and Marco Rubio.
Okay.
Suggesting a more expansive role for the U.S.
Yeah.
Potentially, involving Ukraine's entire energy infrastructure.
Wow.
And their argument is that, American ownership of those plants would be the best protection for Ukrainian infrastructure.
So basically, like, if the U.S. owns it, then Russia wouldn't attack it.
Right, exactly.
That's a pretty significant proposition.
Yeah, I mean...
What are the implications of that?
It has huge implications.
Yeah.
But then, we have Olga Kosharna. She's a Ukrainian nuclear energy expert.
Okay.
And she points out, a really fundamental legal challenge here.
Yeah.
Ukrainian law actually prohibits the privatization of nuclear power plants.
Oh, wow.
So that seems like a pretty big hurdle to overcome.
That's a big one.
Yeah, it really underscores how even seemingly straightforward proposals
run into this really complex web of national laws and sovereignty concerns in this conflict.
Yeah, like it's not as easy as just, signing on the dotted line.
Right, exactly.
Okay, well, let's move on to this ceasefire concerning energy infrastructure.
Okay.
So it sounds like Zelensky agreed to a temporary pause in Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure following his talk with Trump.
Yeah.
But the details around this seem pretty specific.
Yeah, they are. And what's crucial to understand is that this was initially a Russian proposal.
Really?
Yeah, so Ukraine only agreed to it kind of reluctantly, and it seems like under considerable pressure, probably from the U.S.
Interesting.
But there's still, a lot of uncertainty surrounding, when and how this ceasefire will actually be implemented.
Well, Zelensky said in Finland, everything will continue to fly until there is an appropriate document.
Right.
Which makes it seem like there isn't really a concrete agreement. That's a great point. I think it really highlights this lack of a concrete agreement or, maybe a lack of trust.
Yeah.
That the agreement will even be honored.
Well, Ukrainian officials have said that they think that Putin is just trying to buy time.
Right.
To allow his forces to regroup.
Yeah, that's a very valid concern.
Yeah.
And, they've openly voiced these concerns, that Putin's primary objective here isn't, a genuine move towards peace.
Right.
but a maneuver to buy time to, allow his military to regroup and recover.
Especially after Ukraine's successful attacks on Russian oil refineries.
Absolutely. And there's this talk of potentially expanding this, limited ceasefire to include naval operations in the Black Sea.
Right.
With these technical teams scheduled to meet in Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
But, given the history of broken agreements, Kyiv has to be incredibly cautious about any commitments coming from Moscow.
Yeah. Can you really blame them?
Right. The deep-seated distrust stemming from, repeated violations makes it extremely difficult for Kyiv to, have any real confidence in these agreements.
Right. So let's talk about Putin then and what his strategy is here.
Yeah.
He flat out rejected this 30-day ceasefire.
Right.
But then offered this other one.
Right. This a more limited one focused on energy targets.
Yeah. So what's the logic there?
Well, the prevailing analysis seems to be that this is a very tactical move.
Right.
As we've already talked about, Ukraine's attacks on these Russian oil refineries have had a real impact.
Right.
So, this limited ceasefire on energy targets offers Russia a window to kind of stabilize their fuel production. And, logistics, providing some much-needed respite for their, ongoing military operations.
Okay, so they need to regroup.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, we know that Ukraine is way less dependent on its own energy infrastructure now than they were at the start of the war.
That's true.
So does that mean that this concession, from Russia isn't as significant as it would have been earlier?
Yeah, I think it does shift the dynamic somewhat.
Okay.
While safeguarding critical infrastructure is always, a priority.
Of course.
Ukraine's increased resilience in the energy sector means that this specific concession from Russia might not be as, strategically impactful as it would have been earlier in the conflict.
So I thought it was interesting what the Finnish president Alexander Stubb said.
Yeah, what was that?
He was very skeptical of this whole thing. He basically said, it's a clear yes or no on a ceasefire.
Right.
Without preconditions.
Yeah.
And criticized, Putin for being so selective.
Right.
And I think that kind of reflects a wider European perspective.
Absolutely.
They're just not buying this.
Yeah, European leaders are by and large, deeply skeptical of these Trump-Putin, initiated discussions. There's a strong underlying belief that Putin's diplomatic overtures are primarily aimed at securing significant military concessions from Ukraine, essentially weakening their military capabilities.
So he's just trying to get Ukraine to disarm, so that they can't fight back.
Exactly, and the EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas, she was very direct, stating that it is clear that Russia does not really want to make any kind of concessions.
Right.
And, that seems to reflect the general sentiment across Europe.
Totally.
The EU has very sternly rejected any demands from the Kremlin to, stop arming Kyiv, underscoring their commitment to, supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself.
Yeah.
And, we're also seeing Ukraine, actively strengthening its own defenses. The arrival of these F-16 fighter jets. That's a very significant development.
Yeah.
And, the EU itself is making this really substantial push towards, greater self-reliance in defense. So these discussions about supplying Ukraine with millions of artillery rounds and this huge defense funding package really points to a long-term, strategic shift.
Right, so they're getting serious.
Yeah.
Okay, well, so despite all this talk of ceasefires and all this diplomatic activity, it also seems like Russia's actions completely contradict any suggestion of de-escalation.
Right. It's like they're saying one thing and doing another.
Yeah. What are some examples of that?
Well, what's really concerning is this continued pattern of Russian drone and missile attacks targeting, Ukraine's vital infrastructure.
Right.
So we've seen renewed strikes on hospitals,
wow,
railway energy networks in the Dnipropetrovsk region.
Right.
And these are happening even while these ceasefire discussions are supposedly in progress.
It's crazy, right?
It is. And, Zelensky himself, immediately drew attention to this contradiction, underscoring the contrast between Putin's words and actual events happening on the ground.
Yeah. It's hard to trust anything he says at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
And, of course, Ukraine has responded with its own retaliatory attacks.
Right.
Drone attacks on Russian energy assets like the fire at the Kavkazskaya oil pipeline station. So it's this, cycle of action and reaction that makes, achieving a sustainable ceasefire so difficult.
Right. So it just keeps escalating.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are the key takeaways here for you?
Well, I think, the diplomatic landscape surrounding the Ukraine war is incredibly intricate.
Yeah.
It's characterized by these tentative ceasefire proposals, all this, strategic maneuvering by all the involved parties, and this really profound lack of trust.
Between Ukraine and Russia.
Between Ukraine and Russia.
Right.
So, Trump's renewed engagement definitely introduces, this unique and somewhat unpredictable element. But as we've seen, clearly illustrated by Russia's actions and their maximalist demands, substantial obstacles to achieving a lasting peace remain.
So it's not looking good.
No.
Well, for you, our listener.
Yeah.
Hopefully this deep dive has provided a clearer picture of all the different things going on here.
Right.
These negotiations and the motivations of Trump, Putin, and Zelensky.
Right.
I think the question that we're all left with here is this genuine?
Right.
Are these genuine steps towards de-escalation?
Right.
Or is this like pause, a way for everyone to reposition themselves?
Right.
And maybe escalate things again later?
Absolutely.
So.
And, what indicators should you be paying attention to really discern, the true direction of this conflict?
Right.
That's the crucial question to keep in mind as these events unfold.
Absolutely.
So.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See it.